10 years ago, we founded this company, which is called Direct People. And we were the first one in Czech Republic to take a different approach to new products and development of them. We started to build systematically new products, and but most importantly, things, products, services that solve real problems in the world, that somehow make people's life better. Doesn't matter if it is with working for bank, insurance company, or a technological company. We truly believe that this is the only way and the only sustainable way to do the real innovation and create real long-term sustainable businesses. It is a great passion of us, sometimes big adrenaline and adventure, because of course doing that we were looking a little bit for our own business model. And we are still here today. We are still doing it and we still love it. We are 50 people with a branch in Poland, Slovakia, with some daughter companies, and we keep looking for doing things better, more effectively, more efficiently. And it's very interesting that this year we are celebrating 10 years of since our birthday, so 10 years. So it's like we are entering teenage age. So we become more cheeky probably. And we decided to give us a small present, or big present in fact. It's an unusual present because it has a form of human being. Maurya, welcome to Prague. I was fascinated when I discovered Ash 10 years ago because I was hungry, or maybe 11, 12 years ago, I was hungry for learning more about innovations. I was working for big companies many years ago, and I was fascinated by the problem that everyone is working on innovation projects, a lot of intelligent people, big budgets, but the result somehow wasn't there all the time. Yeah? It was like a really bad situation, and I was keep searching for answers, how to make it differently, how to change the paradigm, because the results were like 10% of projects were delivering the business results. So if you improve this by 30%, you will get 13%. It's not much, right? So you have to change it in multiples. It's a change of paradigm. And I found four teachers. I found Steve Blank, who wrote 4 Steps for Epiphany, who was a teacher of Eric Ries, who later wrote Lean Startup. I found Clayton Christensen, who wrote the amazing book Innovator's Dilemma, who is still very much valid and one of the best books on innovation ever. David Kelly, as a founder of IDEO, and Maurya. And I was looking for all his videos, and I was like, wow, this guy has the most systematic and approach and the ability to really teach. Out of these 4 guys, he is the most of one that I would call teacher, because he is able, his sentence can be put into the stone and is perfectly understandable and is moving something forward. And it has a most usable form. It's most how-to approach that can be used. So I'm really happy that Ash is here. I never expected, so that's my way of repaying for stealing your videos 10 years ago. So our present includes intensive training and opportunity to spend time with Ash. We are spending 3 days with him now, the whole company of our 30, 40 people. Ash is like Master Yoda for us, our regular innovation Jedis. And we are really happy that he's here. And we are also happy that you come and you accepted this invitation. I hope that you will enjoy this evening on the science of product development and this part of innovation. And one more surprise, we are not done with presents. We also have Ash book, Running Lean, Lean podnikání in Czech, which was published by Albatros Media House, this book branch. And I would like to thank Miss and Mrs. Horák, Mr. and Mrs. Miss Horák, sorry, who are owners of Albatros, for giving us these presents for free for everybody of you, and we will distribute at the end of the event. And also thanks to Ash for signing all these books. You will find some words there from him. Stay lean. So thank you very much, and I'm giving word to Ash.
So I'm going to set some context for the work that I've been doing. A lot of my work, Peter mentioned, is very how-to. I get inspired with a lot of theory, but one of my mantras was practice trumps theory. A lot of entrepreneurship is like a martial art. You can't just read it, you have to do it, and then you have to find your own way. So a lot of this work that we'll talk about has come through lots of experiments, lots of failed experiments, I should say, ups and downs. And the outcome is always, can we build better products? Can we build better products faster? And it's not so much about lean or lean startup. We are committed to finding better ways. And that's something we also see in the culture with direct people, which was why we can talk so openly, because we're in a way both learning from each other on what some of those better ways are. So what I want to talk to you about today is this concept of continuous innovation. You probably heard, we talked about Clayton Christensen, disruptive innovation, sustained innovation. What is continuous innovation and why does that matter today? So I want to set some context and then share a few principles and mindsets, and then really turn this into more of a discussion, collaboration. So we'll have some time for discussion, questions. We'll try to get you to share some of the challenges that you're going through, and we'll set the stage as we go along. This slide kind of shows how we have built products over the years. I know a number of us have lived through many of these transitions. So I'd like to set some context. The first thing I would say is that a lot of these transitions happen not because a group of people come together and say, now it's time to find a better way to build products. A lot of these transitions happen because of some change in customer behavior and consumer behavior, how they demand products, how they consume products. So we'll kind of go back in time and not spend, we're not going to spend an hour doing this, so it's just a quick overview. But going back 100 years or so, we were living in the manufacturing era, in the factory era, where mass production was the name of the game. And the companies that could produce the most amount of products at the least cost won. After the war, there was a lot of shortage of resources, and this is where just-in-time became big. Taiichi Ohno in Toyota started playing around and really getting deep into applying that. That turned into the Toyota production system, which turned into lean manufacturing. And the name of the unfair advantage here was efficiency. If you can be super efficient, you win this game. As we moved into more of the digital era, we took a lot of the product development thinking that we had, stage-based, what became eventually waterfall, into that era. So we applied the same techniques, we systemized the process. The unfair advantages came from those who could analyze, plan, execute. So execution was the name of the game. So speed of execution, or I should say execution discipline was the name of the game. This is what that looked like. Again, many of us have lived through this. There's a phase in the beginning where we go and understand customers' requirements. We then go away for long periods of time building this product. And sometimes there's a year, 2 years. In government, we have the old joke, if you're going to raise money for any project, raise twice as much, one to learn and the other to get it right. But so you had long cycle times. And then you would release the product, and hopefully that first one was the learning one, and then the second one is where you get it right. As this began to move into the computer era, the PC computing era, waterfall became too slow. And so this is where we started to move, or some people started coming up with various methodologies, thinking XP, extreme programming. There are all kinds of things happening. They eventually got codified under the umbrella of Agile. That was kind of in the late 90s, still going on today. I know some of you are still picking up Agile and doing digital transformation. So in those cases, this is about when it started, but it's an ongoing initiative. The name of the game here was iteration. How can we manage changing requirements in a fast pace? So how can we be iterative in this development? So as you can see, there were some touch points here where we pause and we course correct. So this is what the Agile era looked like. And then the world changed again. As we moved into the internet era, things started to move even faster. At this point, even the fast agile cycles weren't enough. By the time we gathered requirements and built things and gave them to customers, we were finding markets starting to change rather quickly. And so this is where we had to move into something a lot more continuous. We had to find ways to learn from customers all the time, because by the time we got the requirements, built things, gave it to them, in certain industries these move faster than others, but requirements can change rather quickly. There's another trend that happened, which we'll talk about here shortly. Around 2010, a group of people came together and observed this new way of working, and that's what led to the lean startup. So people like Steve Blank, Eric Ries. I was one of those entrepreneurs that was struggling with ways of building things people wanted, and so started blogging and joining the conversation and kind of helped to help spark that lean startup movement. So the lean startup is what we call that continuous innovation era, and it looks a little bit like that. So you have all the same stages. So product development hasn't really changed fundamentally. We still have to talk to customers, understand requirements, but what has changed is the speed at which we do it. All of those things are crunched together. And that's kind of the big messages here. And so it's no longer enough to go away for long periods of time. We have to find ways of continuous learning from customers. And that learning can turn into a continuous model for delivery. Now, if I actually just stay back on this slide, waterfall and agile were not bad. They were just the right types of approaches for the time. But because we are moving really fast, a number of things have happened. Other trends, cost of product development has fallen to an all-time low. It's cheaper and faster for a startup to pop up anywhere today, start building products. I know some of you are building complex products. There's drug companies, but startups are entering all of those types of markets. There's cloud computing and globalizations, open source. All of these technologies create what I like to call the global entrepreneurial renaissance. Entrepreneurship was often relegated to just two guys in a garage in Silicon Valley. Today, that's no longer the case. You're seeing people pop up all over the place doing stuff. This is an interesting statistic. There were 100 million startups that started in 2018. These, of course, were not successful startups, so you don't need to get too worried. But at the same time, that's a very big number. If we put this in context, that is 3 startups a second. So if I pause for 3 seconds, there's another group of people coming together around the kitchen table saying, I have an idea, let's do something with it. So it doesn't take much. It's a bit of a numbers game, right? So when you're getting so many people test a lot of ideas fast and continuously, a few of them start to break through. And these have certain ramifications. So some of these statistics are out there. Disruption, people talk about it. The pace of disruption has been accelerating. Many of these companies, well-known brands that many of us grew up with, are no longer with us or no longer with us with their original models. Oftentimes, some of them even invented their own poison pill, like Kodak, paused the idea for until it was too late. So those types of things happen. So it's not that these companies weren't inventive, they just weren't innovative. And so I make that distinction. Invention is seeing where the future is, coming up with a new way, maybe potentially in the lab. Innovation is taking that invention to market and taking it out. From that definition, a company like Apple comes to mind as being innovative, and they invent a lot of things, but what they're most known for is taking other people's inventions to market. So that's what they're really good at doing, to solve old problems in kind of new ways. So that's another way to say that. So the big message here is the best way to find lots of big ideas is to continuously test them. So testing lots of ideas will get you there. Some of the early adopters of lean startup were startups, so companies like this, Dropbox, Airbnb, both massive companies, everyone knows them today. I remember when they were in the conferences talking about their early experiments, and so they both were started up just 10 years ago, and they're now massive, massive companies. So those were the success stories, but there are others, and these are big, big companies. So the reason I like to share these slides is these are other people who have been embodying this idea of rapid experimentation right from the very beginning. So going back to 1994, a company like Amazon had this notion of running experiments. So Jeff Bezos has always talked about taking big bets, and he uses baseball as an analogy. In baseball, if you hit a home run, you get 4 points. If you hit a home run in business, you get 4 billion points, right? So you have to take these big bets. So they always measure their success. A lot of their products like Amazon Web Services, even their Amazon Prime, were seen as bad mistakes. Even their board said that's not a good idea, but they proved them wrong. So they were able to find these big opportunities. Another company that you all know, this is just to illustrate the speed at which one can actually experiment. At any given point in time, 10,000 versions of Facebook. These leaders are telling the world and even their employees is that we, as the leaders of this company, don't necessarily know where the idea is going to come from. We're going to collectively test. We're going to build infrastructure to test lots of ideas to find the next big ones. Now, these again are massive scale companies, and they are doing this at an extreme level. You don't nearly have to go this fast. Speed is all relative. Other companies that are in the space, some of them you'll recognize, Intuit, Procter & Gamble, all kind of embody this idea of, this culture, I should say, of rapid experimentation. So a lot of where they came and where they have gained prominence today, like Netflix, are in by trying to understand customer behavior, trying to make these predictions of where the customers are going to by studying, understanding that kind of behavior. So the common thread in all of these is where we can introduce the new unfair advantage. The new unfair advantage is really about speed of learning. If you can outlearn your competition, you win. If you can do this once, you get to build a product that nobody wants. But if you do this continuously, you can basically make your business models be defensible. So it's kind of going defense against other people trying to steal customers away. So it's a continuous kind of innovation approach. And that's why we use the term continuous innovation. So rather than stop and go, in the new world, innovation is not really something relegated to a group that builds products. It should be something that's everyone's job, is trying to figure out new forms of value creation, new ways of bringing these products to market. The point I wanted to make early on is speed is relative. So we look at a company like Facebook or Amazon moving very fast, running lots of experiments a day. You don't have to run 10,000 experiments. You only have to move faster than your closest competitor. It's the old joke, you've probably all heard it, where there's a bear in the jungle or in the forest, and a guy starts tying his sneakers and starts to run, and his friend says, "You can't outrun a bear, where are you going?" He's like, "I don't need to outrun the bear, I only need to outrun you." And that's where speed comes in. You have to outlearn your competition. If you can outlearn your competition, you gain an advantage. And of course, you have to know how to put that to action. So why isn't everyone doing this? A lot of this has been out there. A lot of this makes sense, even common sense to a lot of people. It's like, yes, we should do some of these things. Some of the challenges that I find is really more in the switches. As we move from one way of doing things to the other, we have to build new skills. We have to unlearn old skills. And we have built a lot of familiarity around old ways of doing things. Even today, as people make the transition to Agile, we find some of the product teams adopt it quicker, but sometimes some of the business stays behind in waterfall. So you see a lot of Wagile or waterfall disguised as Agile, where you do this hybrid approach. And unfortunately, when you're trying to play with business models, that approach does not always work so well. So those are some of the inherent challenges that we see. The way to kind of overcome them is by starting to build internal culture change. And it doesn't start with tactics. When I see a lot of people trying to apply these techniques, they'll take a lot of the tools, they'll take a lot of the tactics, like let's do more experiments, let's just run A/B tests, let's go and talk to customers. But if you don't know how to do these things, you do a lot of needless busy work and don't get the results. So you really have to start with mindsets at the very center and then work your way out these outer rings towards how-tos and skills. And then there can be some playbooks which you can systematize in your companies to drive better outcomes. So I want to share with you 3 top problems and then 3 mindsets that potentially help in overcoming those challenges. So one of the problems that we run into is this one here. People in your company have this promising idea, but because it's easy for anyone to have an idea, we have to put some dates on them. So we tell them, if you're going to invest in this idea, if we're going to give you resources, go show me the business case or the business plan. That's an elaborate, big document. Go show me the financial forecast with 5-year projections. Go show me the product roadmap of what you're going to go build. And most of the innovators that I talk to don't really have a problem with doing these documents. The problem is early stages of ideas, these things are simply unknowable. It's not that they don't want to do the work, you just can't create these artifacts. And you can, if you're determined, you make the stuff up. So those innovators that make the stuff up move to the second challenge. And by the way, before we go to the second challenge, this is the number 2 killer of ideas. The number 2 killer of ideas is putting people through this fictional planning process based on a plan that they can't really defend, but they have to do the work if they need to get the green light on their project. It's not the number 1 killer. We'll talk about the number 1 killer a bit later. But let's say you're an innovator, you are determined to move forward. You go ahead. We then run into the second challenge, which is you've created a plan, and now if we use the waterfall execution mindset, we start judging people by execution of this plan. And as Steve Blank said, no plan stands the test of customers. The moment you start building product and showing it to customers, the plan starts to change. There's not a business plan that I've seen that has stayed intact. But the problem, of course, is when you start to change that plan, changing the plan is a sign of weakness. It's often seen as not have done enough planning in the first place, and that's penalized. And so oftentimes people pretend like the plan is not changing, but internally they're trying to make the business model work. So it's a dichotomy of two bosses. You have the internal boss, which is let's build the right thing, and then the external message that you're sharing with your stakeholders, which is just an awful waste of resources. So that's the challenge we run in here. And what usually ends up is we report on a lot of execution velocity metrics, like build velocity. Are we building our project? Are we executing our plan on time and on budget? But if you launch and that's the wrong product, that in my book is in progress. That's just building something nobody wants on time and on budget. We want to build the right product instead. So that's the challenge of how do we really measure these types of things when we are moving really fast. This is the last one I'll kind of raise in the problem area, is when you have this elaborate, big planning process, it's very hard to execute on a lot of ideas at the same time. You can only execute on a few big ideas. And when there's so much due diligence happening, oftentimes only the safe ideas get through, or the safer ideas get through. The crazy ones get discarded because there's not much room for innovating, or there's not much room for budgets or working on those ideas. And so this is oftentimes what happens. If you aren't going to disrupt yourself, the business model is going to get disrupted. It's just going to happen elsewhere. So oftentimes by the time you react, there is a different strategy. If you've read Jeffrey Moore's book, Crossing the Chasm, he talks about how to defend against. And so there are some strategies you can use to not be that first mover in innovation, but you get a lot more benefits if you are that first to market innovator. Okay, so let's talk about a few of the mindsets and how we can address these challenges. And we'll, kind of share some of your comments and challenges and try to have a discussion around that. So if you take this first one, the challenge of the business planning, the elaborate heavyweight business planning process, this is where the challenges with the big document is that it creates this fictional document. Oftentimes in the startup world and even in the corporate world, the people who make you write these documents unfortunately don't read all of it because it's really a barrier to entry. It's really more trying to see, are you serious enough with your idea? So it's a test for that rather than a test for the viability of the idea. In more recent years, we have this one-page kind of business modeling tool. So we talked about earlier the business model canvas. When there's a lot of uncertainty, when you're moving really fast, you need a dynamic model, not a static plan, because the plans are going to change rather quickly. And so this is where the business model canvas was the first one that came on stage. I iterated on that and created something that we call the Lean Canvas. It looks something like this. Some of you may have seen this before. If you haven't, think of it as a one-page idea capture tool. So it's like a one-page business plan. It allows you to describe who your customers are, what their problems are, what solution you might build, go-to-market channels, revenue streams, cost structure. How would you measure success, key metrics, unfair advantage? How would you defend against competition? Now, obviously, there are a lot more facets to building a successful product or building a business. This is a prioritization of the top 9 things, and it oftentimes are the riskiest things that make products fail. So the top risk, the number one killer of ideas is building something nobody wants. And the number one cause of that is we build a solution, we fall in the innovator bias trap, which is we fall in love with the technology or a solution, and we don't spend enough time understanding customers and problems. And so that's why in this canvas, that is front and center. and we spend a lot of time trying to get innovators to first describe customers and problems before they get down to building out their solution. So that's the first mindset I'll share with you, is that the solution itself, an important box, but notice I made it very small here. It's one of the smallest boxes on the canvas by design, because you put an innovator on stage and they can talk for hours on their solution. If you ask them about some of these other pieces, this is the real product that they're building. So the real mindset here is thinking of the business model as the product, not just the solution. Problem number 2, which is the metrics problem. What do we really measure when we are in the product development phase? When we don't really have revenue or profit? I mean, we have them, they're just all negative. That's a problem. So you can't go and report on those things. So what do you report on instead? This is where we need to shift our focus from outputs to outcomes. So when we talk about outputs, we can measure build velocity, execution velocity. Outcomes are more about measuring what is it that our stakeholders and our innovators, our makers want. And the one thing that I found that commonly both people want is growth, is traction. And we can start demonstrating traction. In the beginning, it's not a lot, but it's not zero. We can start testing ideas. We can start sharing concepts. We can measure engagement, interest, those types of things. And so you can start measuring traction very early on. And of course, when we hit the inflection point, that's when everyone gets excited. If you were a startup and I showed up in an investor's office, I don't even have to label the y-axis. If I say I have a startup that's doing this, I'll create a Pavlovian response. They will sit me down and tell me to share my idea with them, because growth is something everyone understands. Now, the question, of course, is what do we put in the y-axis? A lot of people want to measure revenue and profit, but I would argue that revenue and profit are not the right metrics. Those are trailing indicators, not leading indicators. And what I mean by that is that all growth, all revenue and profit come from the actions of your customers, and you need to figure out what are those causal things they are doing. What is that traction metric that they are doing that can predict future revenue? The dangers with revenue and profit is that when you have a good quarter, everyone takes credit for it. It's like everyone's contribution. When we have a bad quarter, nobody takes credit for it, right? All fingers point to other people. It's not my fault, it's the other person's fault. And so if you had a leading indicator like traction, which is a customer engagement metric, you can begin to measure as a predictor of revenue what's happening in a quarter. You can actually predict revenue or profit before they actually happen. The last piece over here, execute only a few ideas at a time. There needs to be a concept of building an infrastructure where you can make many small bets. So a few big bets is putting all your eggs in a few baskets. You've got to be able to make many small bets. And that requires a different kind of thinking. So it requires thinking like you think of your retirement portfolios, your investment portfolios, diversification, portfolio management. So building an idea funnel. And there's actually a numbers game to this as well. Is if we start to study ideas as a numbers game, just as I said, there are 100 million startups. It only takes a few of them to get through. If you can similarly run not 100 million experiments, but if you can run a number of experiments in your company and vet them quickly, it only will take a few of them to hit that breakthrough piece there. So to kind of put all of this together, when we look at the problem of the traditional innovation funnel, too many ideas, bottlenecks in figuring out the right ones to invest in. So this is no longer a problem, but figuring out the right ones to really chase down is still challenging because there are no clear progress metrics. And so again, the safer ideas, the ones that seem more believable get through, the crazy ones get left off, but those are often the ones that can help with future disruption or avoidance of it. So if we look at the continuous innovation funnel, it looks a little bit different. It changes the picture here. So we're not looking at big business plans. We're doing very small lean canvases or business model canvases as a way to capture ideas. And these are guesses or hypotheses. We then use rapid experimentation in fast iterations to start to measure traction in these businesses. So traction becomes that measure of progress. And if you get the requisite traction, you move on to the next stage. It's a stage gate type of an approach. And if you don't, you silently kill an idea. There are other mindset shifts. So killing ideas is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily failure. If you look at companies like Google, or which now Alphabet, which is a spin-off of Google, they actually reward team members for killing ideas. But not because they give up, but because they come in front of the team, do a presentation, and can prove with absolute certainty that this idea will never work. So you might have heard of Google's hot air balloon project, where they were trying to put internet through hot air balloons. An engineer walks in the room, spends 30 minutes on a whiteboard, and convinces his team that this will never work, it's not feasible. And the team agrees, and he walks out with a big fat bonus check. And the reason that they get the bonus is because he just saved the team lots of resources. They can now go work on the next moonshot project. So that's, again, a different culture that you have to develop, which is a search versus execution culture. So again, once we have the traction metric, once we can create stages, you can begin to measure these ideas that they're going through. In the earliest stages, this is where cultural transformation comes in. You have to be patient. It's less about the idea quality and more about the learning mindsets you can create in your teams. So I would almost advise people to allow a lot of these ideas to go through, and of course time box them. So give teams a lot of freedom to experiment, but give them only 3 months and maybe a few resources, 5 to 7 people. So smaller budgets, but lots of room to experiment. And you're going to build this muscle for experimentation, of rapid idea testing. And over time, these teams are the ones that start to create big breakthroughs. You see this in many professional accelerators. Y Combinator is one of the most successful accelerators in the world. The way they select their teams is not on the merits of their ideas. They do a 6-minute interview, and they're looking for certain skills, soft skills, coachability, how they think, how they challenge ideas, how smart they think in terms of testing their ideas. And so there have been many teams that they have taken in, and they've told them, we like you as a team, we hate your idea, so give up your idea and you can come in. And since you don't have one, we'll give you a temporary idea for the time being, because we know you'll find something better, right? So this is this mindset. And some of these teams, in a span of 3 months, go through 30 ideas. And they find one that has this breakthrough potential, and then that's the one that they work in. So again, a very different mindset in the early stages. So I shared some big case studies up front. Those were not mine. I wasn't involved in them. So I want to share with you a practical case study we did with Cisco, which, as you can see a bit from the headline, it was from an idea that a couple of innovators had to almost getting fired eventually because they didn't have the right place to practice this, to actually turning into Innovation of the Year. So they got an award from the CEO of Cisco. These founders were in Switzerland, not too far from here, and they reached out to me very early on. So they had read my early book. They had been working on a project. So the big problem they were trying to solve, without getting into a lot of details, was how do we mitigate the problem of 1 million trouble tickets a month? That's how many trouble tickets Cisco gets. And a lot of people were working on different approaches to this problem. This team decided to go and apply some of the techniques they were learning from this framework. So they went and talked to some of their friendly customers, did some interviews, understood some of the challenges and problems they had. Why were these trouble tickets issues? What were some of the problems that the customers had? So they began to understand a deeper understanding of problems. They then began to mock up some solutions. They went to the customers and kind of pitched them, and the customer said, yeah, this could potentially work, and gave them permission to install an minimum viable product into their network. And that's where they made a bit of a mistake, because technically Cisco has rules against that. You can't just install things into a production network without a lot of testing. But the customer was a friendly customer. He's like, yeah, come and do this. The good news is that nothing bad happened. This product actually worked very well. And so these guys rushed to their managers and said, look, we have done this, and the customer loves it. And the manager said, you did what? Because you don't do that without permission. So they got a big slap on the wrist. So they didn't get fired, because Cisco has a culture of startups. They have grown up with startups. They were a startup not that long ago, and the whole culture is one of startups. But what they quickly recognize is that we have innovators going behind innovating and asking for forgiveness later. And that's just not the right culture they wanted to create. So that's when they brought me in, and the way I led that workshop in the beginning was with this slide. I told them, in theory, a large company should never fail against a small startup. You've got more money, more resources, you've got access to customers, you have all the unfair advantages. So why does a startup win? To me, it's very simple. Startups struggle because they can't find enough customers. They don't have all those things that you have the resources. But the biggest thing is they struggle with acquisition, customer acquisition. They can't really talk to the customers, they can't learn fast enough, and so they don't build things that people want. A lot of big companies fail because they stop talking to their own customers. Or when they do, they build a lot of layers between what the customer really says, what they really want, to the people doing the work. It's a game of elephant whisper or Chinese whisper. By the time it gets there, it's so garbled up that what we build is not always the right thing. And so what we worked out with Cisco after this slide was ways to kind of create speed in talking to customers. So these engineers went behind their backs. What if we could make that a policy? What if they didn't? So the salespeople were not too happy because these engineers went and built a product and essentially they didn't sell it, but they almost did to the customer, and the salespeople were angry because they weren't part of the process. So we had a big sit down and we tried to figure out rules of engagement. So for testing, one of the rules was we can create a short list of early adopter customers that any engineer can go talk to, right? So these are friendly customers and we can do all kinds of tests with them. You don't need permissions, anyone can go do that. So that's the biggest challenge for the people, the makers, talking to customers in big companies. How do you do it? So that was one of the things. The other was legal, right? So this was one of those things where there was a big legal potential problem. The customer was fine with the risk, so it was not a big issue. But in moving forward, they had to come up with an easier mutual NDA and all these legal procurement types of things. So they found a way with the legal team to create a one-page version of what normally is 30, 40 pages of documents and lawyers going back and forth that these teams could use. So those are simple examples where you can look at a lot of processes that generally take a long time and try to speed that up. The biggest thing, though, going back to what I said early on, is making this shift is going to be uncomfortable. You have to get outside the comfort zone. This is a little bit of early days of Agile, so I lived through this transformation myself. I was working in a nice, comfortable cubicle, and one day my manager pulls me out, and I'm going to work in this war room with this consultant who's going to watch over you every 8 hours a day, and you have to do these stand-ups and tell them everything you're doing. And I thought I was being punished. I'm like, what is happening here? Like, why am I being watched? Why am I being micromanaged? But this wasn't micromanaged. It was a new model of working. What eventually became Agile, some of you are living through, this is a new model of working too. When people, instead of staying in the company, writing code or spending time in the lab, are leaving to go talk to customers, that is the new work. That's actually learning. That's actually things that we can do. When we spend more time building infrastructure where we can collect data so that we can measure what it is that we are delivering, that's again the new way of working. So there are going to be some new skills and some new things, new ways of operating, and that's what this new era looks like. So hopefully that was some context setting for what continuous innovation is, and I'll turn it back to Peter.
Thank you very much.